morning, everybody. Good morning to the participants from India. Good evening to those from US and early or midnight maybe for European friends. It's always a pleasure to meet you all on the monthly webinar series of Archaeological Sciences Center. And we are here again. The first lecture of 2022 is the 16th lecture of our series, and it's going to be delivered by Professor Monica Smith. Professor Smith does not require any introduction due to her work. She has done extensive research in the early historical aspects of South Asia. Her work in the Sisupalgarh and many of the contemporary sites in Odisha, it has been a wonderful eye-opener and also new interpretative research involving various kind of technologies, including GIS and predictive modeling, and have helped us in understanding various aspects of the early historical archaeology of South Asia. We welcome on behalf of Archaeological Sciences Center, we welcome Professor Monica Smith to having sparing some of her valuable time to deliver this talk. Thank you very much for that, Professor Monica. And without wasting much time, I would request you to please deliver the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I would like to thank all of my friends and colleagues at IIT Gandhinagar and all of the people whose work have made this presentation possible. It's a great pleasure to join you here in your morning to talk about the ways in which we can understand urbanism as a financial series of innovations, in addition to the many other kinds of social, economic, religious, and political activities that happen in urban centers. So this is actually some new work that's coming out of some of the material that was excavated at Sisupalgarh with Professor R.K. Mohanty from Deccan College and a very large, wonderful team of individuals from all over South Asia who came to participate in the excavations with us. So in this talk today, what I'd like to do is to cover 4 different topics. The first is the idea of monetization. In other words, how it is that we get this atomized financial system that we are very familiar with today and that started 2,500 years ago in the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere. And that money is such a thing to be taken for granted that sometimes we don't think about how complex it is and its many social aspects in addition to its economic aspects. The next thing I'll talk about is urban finances, why it is that city finances are different than pre-urban finances, and the many different kinds of activities that are part of urban economies. The third thing I'll talk about is something called the small change problem, which is also a factor in monetization. And finally, I'll close with a case study and a hypothesis about money substitutes at the site of Sisupalgarh on the basis of the excavation work. So let's think first about monetization. Well, people have exchanged things over a very long period of time, hundreds of thousands of years, long before money became a process in the economies of exchange. So one certainly does not need money or standardized units of any kind, whether coins or cowries or any other small thing. People do not need that in order to be able to have a functioning economy. But when we think about the history of coinage, what we see is that there is an acceleration of coinage that occurs, an acceleration of the economy that occurs starting around 2,500 years ago that becomes a significant addition to the economic repertoire that also happens to be very focused and increased in urban environments. When you get means of exchange, the way that money is utilized, what you get is not just a handy unit that you can carry around in your pocket, but you also get the use of coinage as an information-bearing device, because coins are not blank pieces of metal. They're always inscribed with something or punched with something. And money becomes a possibility for proclamations, for social advertising, and for political proclamations as well. So this is why rulership is often tightly tied into the idea of money, power, the state, coinage, propaganda. And even when we conceptualize ancient history, we're often equating the concept of the development of the state or the development of urban places, we're equating that with money because we are used to thinking about coinage as a form of political propaganda, as a political statement, and as a state level control of economic activities. But money is a made up thing. And when we start to think about money as a social phenomenon, this book is a very eye-opening perspective on what money is. This book by Jacob Goldstein is called Money, the True Story of a Made Up Thing. Because money is still evolving as a concept, although the concept of coinage has been around for about 2,500 years. The idea of what constitutes value, which is only represented in coinage, but also represented in things like paper money and even electronic money, what we can see is that the concept of money as a made-up thing is not completely fixed to date. It's still changing. There are still new forms of money that are emerging. For example, this is what people are talking about now, because there's this new thing called crypto. What is it? Does anyone really know? But it's a very popular concept, and people are taking what we would think of as real money, things that could be coming from coins, and they are buying this electronic thing. So you have something that is not tangible at all, but it is accumulating value, and people are trading it out there in the ether somewhere. In fact, a lot of what makes crypto work is not just its economic value, but its social value. So for example, here's an advertisement from the website PayPal, and they are using the idea of friendship and trust to get people to engage with this new monetary item, which is basically a completely made up thing, but it is becoming real because people believe in it, even though it has no tangibility whatsoever. So what's the relationship between governments and popularly conceived money? We can see that the advent of any new monetary system like Bitcoin or other kinds of cryptocurrencies are things that are of immediate interest, especially when they become high value, to governments who then want to be able to control or tax them because they are a kind of extra governmental funding source that has appeared, that has this social connection that somehow is also tied into real money in a fluctuating, volatile kind of way. The result of that is a couple of things. First of all, there's a huge amount of volatility in the concept of cryptocurrency. People have been watching it fluctuate since the very beginning, and those fluctuations are only getting bigger in their swings, including in the last few days as we speak. The other thing that's happening is that government agencies are trying to interact with this unknown quantity and this untangible quantity by inserting themselves into regulatory processes, whether in India or whether in the United States or whether in any other part of the world, every country is trying to come to grips with the meaning of this utterly made up concept that is nonetheless accruing actual real value. People are losing their actual savings as they're plunging into this market in search of profits or gain. So money as a made up thing that is still evolving and that still sometimes takes us by surprise is something that I think that we can also use as a framing device for understanding the beginnings of coinage, when people were first asking other people to accept that a piece of metal could be worth a bushel of rice or a newborn goat or a chicken or a day's worth of work. That was a huge leap of faith, because even though the coin itself was a tangible object, not like Bitcoin that's just out there, even though it was a tangible object, it was an utterly new concept that people had to get used to and to persuade others was a reasonable economic exchange. So to think about the history of coinage, what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to please look at Dr. Abhijit Dandakar's lecture from October, in which he gives a really excellent understanding of the beginning of coinage, the history of coinage, where it was in the world, how Indian coinage began and what it looked like, and so on. So kindly look at that lecture, because it's a very good way of thinking about the beginnings of coinage and all the different activities that occurred in this political realm, because much of what people think about in the early historic period, early centuries BC AD, is the ways in which coinage was a high-level political economic integration. When we think about the beginnings of the early historic period, we also see that this is the beginning not only of the Mahajanapadas and the insertion of political leaders into the economic, social, and religious realms, but we also see that it's the beginning of urbanism. And these urban centers all over the Indian subcontinent are places where finance becomes divergent into two big categories. One is a category that did not exist before because there was no large-scale finance that needed to be done at the village level. People could do collaborative activities at the village level to build a small dam or to corral their animals or to flatten a piece of land for cultivation. And there was no need for coordinating large numbers of people or putting aside the value of labor from one season to the next. Everything got done in a timely way without having to finance or leverage labor or materials for longer term interactions. But in an urban place, as you can see here in this depiction of an early historic city from Sanchi, there are many things that are beyond the capacity of any single household to do, or beyond the capacity of a group at a small occasion, like a seasonal kind of harvesting activity. Urban activities happen all the time and have to overcome seasonality through activities like bureaucracy and administration. So there are things that happen in cities that require a pooled source of funding. So for example, building a fortification wall or a rampart wall, or organizing marketplaces, or keeping streets straight and clean. All of those things require some administrators and some personnel who have to be paid. So this is how you get the beginnings of taxation. You have the need for taxation, the support of a bureaucracy. You have the need for security in an urban environment. You have the need for administrative investments in centralized projects such as infrastructure. So water, waste, transportation, all those kinds of things. That is one of the financial things that happens in an urban environment. The other thing that happens is that ordinary people also engage in many more small-scale transactions, because in an urban environment, most people do not keep a year's worth of food in their home. We know that urban environments are places where people have food, takeaway food, and food that moves around in serving sizes. We know that people engage in labor beyond the household. So they have different types of activities that they do that other people are compensating them for. And there are many more objects that people can get in an urban environment, so that we have many more small-scale transactions by ordinary people. So urban finance is about collective, large-scale finance, but it's also about daily expenditures on a small scale, repeated basis over and over again by ordinary households. A way of thinking about this urban finance is, I think, a nice statement by Susan Sherratt, who says that as long as long-distance exchange was confined to scarce or valuable raw materials, or a few low-bulk, high-value manufactured objects in return for lifestyle luxuries, it seems likely that it was indeed mainly conducted on a formal, high-level gift exchange basis. So in other words, a pre-urban environment is an environment of small-scale goods moving around at a fairly high level. But as the scale of participation increased and the scale and range of manufacturing production began to play a larger part, exchange mechanisms themselves almost certainly became more complex. So that this urban finance of large-scale transactions and repeated small-scale transactions results in a completely different kind of economic environment. How can we evaluate the potential for this transition in the early historic period? What are the literary sources that can give us some insights about the role of monetization and coinage and the finances that are part of urban life? Well, of course, the Arthashastra has many instances of regulation, of finances, administration, coin inspectors. So there is a robust literature that suggests that an awareness of the workings of urban finance are certainly part of the early historic framework. We also have in the region of Odisha the Hathigumpha inscription, in which a large-scale repair by the king Kharavela, speaking the 1st century BC, is characterized as one that is valued in karshapanas. It's valued in money. This does not mean that so many hundreds of thousands of coins were actually circulating, but it's an interesting viewpoint into how the monetization of urban finance is not about getting so many people to do the work, but valuing the infrastructure in terms of money, which is something that we would also see in our contemporary environment, that when somebody is proposing a project, building a bridge or making a new road, it is valued for us in terms of money rather than number of people or number of days or number of machines required or something like that. So that idea of money as a shortcut of thinking is definitely part of the understanding of monetization and urban finance in the early historic period. And then we also see that we have collections of people, small scale people who are coordinating donations at places to be able to offer part of an architectural fragment or part of a donation by a village. So the idea of a collective self-taxation also seems to be evident in the early historic period. So people were conceptualizing this big scale urban finance as well as the cumulative effects of household spending. Now let's think about the small change problem. Do I mean this? Not exactly. But you know from your own life that small change is often something that is not very consequential, a little bit problematic, takes up space. You drop it, you leave it, it falls to the bottom of a bag. That is one type of small change problem, but not quite the one that I have in mind. It's actually an economic problem that has been discussed in great detail by people who think about finance at the national scale. And the concept of the small change problem was articulated in a book by the same name by Sargent and Veld, The Big Problem of Small Change. Economically speaking, small change is a challenging part of the coinage repertoire because the actual coin itself is rarely worth as much as it costs to make. So small change really ought not to exist. From the point of view of a moneyer or a mint, a small change takes up a great deal of time and trouble for very little worth. So central governments tend not to like or care about small change. However, people need small change for small scale transactions. And small change is often in short supply, as you have probably experienced yourself many, many times in the marketplace. What seems to happen is that when you have severe economic growth or economic contraction, there's a lag time between the amount of small change that's circulating in a monetized environment and the quantity of small change that is desired. So there's a mismatch. People want more small change, but it's not available. The mint is not making it. There's not enough circulation, to the extent that that's where the problem is. So it's an economic problem, and it's a financial problem, and it's also a money circulation problem. In fact, even in highly developed, highly monetized circumstances, when you have a severe economic shift, either up or down, you get a small change problem. So these are some images that I snapped here in Los Angeles, which is a very monetized environment. At the local shops, you see these signs that say, the Federal Reserve is experiencing a coin shortage. So the US government is having a coin shortage. And so they cannot give you any change at the grocery store. Another here on the right-hand side, because of the national coin shortage, we are asking our shoppers to pay by credit, debit card, or some other mechanism. Even if you go to the bank to get change, the bank will say, we don't have any change. So everyone's asking, where has the change gone? It's because there is not the circulation of change. And as people are paying with other kinds of means, the idea of small change is becoming less and less common. So it's like a downward spiral of small change availability. In fact, as I mentioned, this is a very common problem in everyday life in India too. And many, many times when going to a shop to buy a small packet of something, you know, it's 9 rupees and you give 10 rupee note or 10 rupee coin and the shopkeeper says, no change. Even though the central government has been minting rupees very conscientiously for a very long time. As you can see here, the size changes, the shape changes, the thickness changes, the writing changes, the year changes, but it's still 1 rupee. Over time, the need for change to replace paper notes has increased. In response, the government mints more small change. 2 rupees, 5 rupees. such that the value of the rupee coin is going up. And over time, the smaller value ones become less desired because they are less useful for purchasing. In fact, there are some coins that have become obsolete, practically. 50 paisa coin. When is the last time that you had a viable transaction with a 50 paisa coin? How about a 10 paisa coin? This is my 10 paisa coin from 1991. And nowadays, I believe the only use for the 10 paisa coin is for people who are giving alms at a temple, that they can take, a larger sum of money and divide it up into tiny, tiny little fragments for people to be able to give 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 as they go down the line. So many times the smallest denominations simply drop out of use, not because the government has retracted it, but because they become less and less useful to people, that they simply stop carrying. And when it falls to the bottom of the bag, they don't try to retrieve it and put it back into circulation. Probably the only time that the government does care about small coinage is when they can successfully persuade people to stop caring about this coin that costs more to make than it is worth. So even in a situation where coins are required, the machine here is very specific: no pennies, please. In Canada, one fine day, they phased out the penny. It was no longer legal. Stores just didn't accept it anymore. And then even here, you see this sign from the Central Bank of the Bahamas, not a place that you would think has significant financial difficulties, but the Bank of the Bahamas has also outlawed pennies. Pennies, be gone. Small change, be gone. Can we see the concept of a small change problem in the early historic period? What is the evidence for small value coinage? Much of the time when people talk about coinage and numismatics, they're focusing on the gold coins, the silver coins, but there are also many hoards that include copper coins, and the idea of different valuations seems to be part of the phenomenon of early historic coinage, and the idea of differential ease of getting the raw materials, so that gold, more difficult to get, more valuable; copper, lead, easier to get and less valuable material that translates into something that we might be able to think of as small value coinage. But how did people feel about coinage? And here is where we can think about hoards as having multiple coins in them. And often when you read about hoards, very seldom is a hoard anywhere in the world, but also in the Indian subcontinent, very seldom is the hoard only of one kind of coin. Hoards tend to have a whole variety of things in them, some higher value coins, silver coins, and copper coins, kind of all mixed in together. That suggests that people had a relatively fluid notion of value, and that it did not bother them to negotiate the currency as well as the rate of currency. We have the same feeling when we accept non-money in change. So when the shopkeeper does not have the 1 rupee for your change, instead, what does the shopkeeper do? Reaches into that big dabba of sweets and gives you 1 or 2 in change. We're getting something that is of a small nominal value that is a placeholder, right? You know that that is not the same as the 1 rupee coin that the shopkeeper ought to be giving you. But it's a time-saving measure because the shopkeeper wants you to go so that he can sell something to somebody else. You also want to go because you're trying to catch the bus or go to work or something. So you accept the fiction of a coin substitute. Do you ever find yourself bargaining that you don't want that chocolate? Amne acha lagta hai. You want the other one, right? In that case, I think you are exactly like the ancient person that looks over all those coins that they're getting and decides that there's one that you don't like, that punch mark, so you don't take it. So even something that is widely regarded as an equivalent to a coin is something that is consciously looked at and considered at the moment of exchange. So what about other kinds of money substitutes? We already have a variety of things like coinage and cards, credit cards, phone credits, and so on. But there are also many other things that have crept in as money substitutes. So like canteen tokens of various kinds, or like the sweets, the chocolates that you get instead of a coin. So actually, even our own modern sense of money is still something that is under constant negotiation. And here are some examples of other things that are not exactly money. They're kind of semi-private, special purpose value tokens. So here's a New York City subway token, now obsolete. Santa Monica bus token, also now obsolete. UCLA campus parking token, also now obsolete. But for a moment, they had a distinct kind of value in which you had to have this token, you had to convert real money into this token to be able to get the thing that you wanted, the transportation or the right to enter the parking structure. So with this idea of money as a made-up thing, the small change problem that is part of monetized economies, the willingness of people to negotiate money substitutes in fluid economic environments, let's think about a hypothesis of money substitutes at the site of Sisupalgarh, early historic settlement. So the site of Sisupalgarh was first excavated by Professor B.B. Lal in 1948 and is a magnificent example of early historic urban landscapes. It has a certain grandeur to it that is still very much something you can feel walking onto the site, looking at the excavated gateway that Professor Lal excavated, looking at the monumental pillars in the central portion of the site, and looking at the magnificent rampart that surrounds the site on all sides, around 1 kilometer square, so that you have this entirely human-made rampart that is an urban statement, like a big urban container that marked the presence of urban life in the early centuries BC AD in eastern Odisha. About 20 years ago, I was first very fortunate to go to Sisupalgarh for an intensive surface survey that enabled us to look at the kinds of materials that were distributed over the site and to recognize that the site of Sisupalgarh was a fully occupied urban landscape and that it was a long-lived settlement that gave us a concept of the robusticity of early historic economic and social landscapes. The rampart itself is something that is remarkably well preserved and that gives you a sense of the amount of planning and labor and consistent investment in the infrastructure of the settlement that was not just a matter of one ruler saying something for one day, but a matter of a long-term, large-scale, urban financed project. And here's some recording of the rampart. Again, this is really magnificent, monumental scale, and a good way of thinking about how urbanism is something that from a landscape perspective, survey is a perfect fit for methodologies to understand the scale of urban activities. The monumental pillars in the center of the site, likewise, are evidence of a consistent, large-scale, directed engineering project that was not the matter of a short period of time, but a very large, planned, sustained activity that was part of the site's ritual infrastructure. And in the course of the excavations at Sisupalgarh, there have been many opportunities to look not only at this magnificent infrastructure of early historic urbanism, but also to look at the small scale household level interactions. In other words, the lives of the ordinary people who came by the thousands to inhabit ancient Sisupalgarh. And so in the excavations that were a joint effort from Deccan College and UCLA, we added on to the areas that had previously been excavated by Professor Lal, and also looked at many other areas of the site as well. So in this sense of excavation, you can start to think about the number of people that would have been required in order to construct the monumental architecture, and then the number of days required, and the accounting, and then the compensation for people, because if they are building the rampart or building the gateway, then they are not working for their own well-being in fields. They are not, doing household work. So there's this other kind of urban investment in which people start to become specialized in different kinds of occupations. Our excavations thus looked at a number of different areas and looked at some of these ordinary kinds of structures and architecture, and the ways in which that urban environment was a combination of many different kinds of economic and social activities. And there were many surprises in the course of the excavations as well, that even though the surface of the site is a complete, magnificent city, there are many other things below the surface as well that indicate just how complex its environment was, as you can see here in the areas of the pillar mound, where there is much more beneath the surface indicative of the architectural and social activities there. And on the scale of ordinary life, we have places like this where we excavated and thinking about real households and real people interacting with other households and spread out over many, many neighborhoods in the urban environment. And some people you may recognize. In addition to the broad horizontal excavations that we're conducting at the site, we also had some deep soundings, which were quite difficult because the modern water table is higher than the earliest deposits, so that the only way that these early deposits could be excavated was to do some continuous pumping to get down below the level of the modern water table, enabling us to get all the way through the many meters of deposits at the site to get down to the very earliest levels of occupation at the site. So we had deep sounding in the western portion of the site and deep sounding in the north central portion of the site. And there you can see Professor Mohanty in the deep sounding that, at the suggestion of the workers who worked with us, who were well diggers, we actually did dig this trench round to have a better stability going down into these waterlogged deposits. And many, many artifacts and objects that the crew diligently, all the people who worked with us, we were excavating in the morning, in the afternoon, were sorting pottery and other materials, and in the evening doing data entry and having discussions and seminars. So it was a very active project in terms of looking at all the materials as they were coming out of the excavation. And for that, there are many, many people to thank. And we've been very fortunate that so many of the students, colleagues who worked with us have become part of their careers was a time shared with us. So we were very privileged for that. And in the examination of the materials, we found many things that looked like things that one might expect from an early historic settlement, but we also paid attention to the small broken things that were equally part of household repertoires. So the little bangle fragments, as well as the more complete objects, the little fragmented pottery, as well as the more larger, better preserved vessels and so on, to get a more comprehensive sense of the activities of the urban environment. And what we saw in our excavations was the counterpart to the big finance of the rampart and the monumental pillars. It was the little finance of these kinds of objects, like terracottas, like all kinds of ornamentations, rings, bangles, bracelets, pendants, ear spools, by the hundreds that we found in the excavations that were indicative of a thriving market and exchange for all kinds of little fancy urban goods of a kind that one did not find in the countryside. They were really part of urban life. And the diversity of these kinds of objects was enormous. We found many different kinds of designs, many different kinds of styles that indicated a thriving urban economy in small scale, cheap goods that would have been paid for somehow. But how? We also found many of these. In the terminology of many site reports, these are called hopscotches, and they are not usually given a great deal of care in recording because they're viewed as something with the name hopscotch. It does not sound very serious, and therefore it does not require some serious attention. From the very beginning of this project, however, we always called these worked sherds as a completely neutral terminology because we did not know what they were for, but we knew that people had spent time in order to shape broken bits of pottery into something that was entirely different. So if we think about these as worked sherds and think of them as artifacts, what can we surmise? Well, first of all that painstaking measuring that people did enables us to look at the distribution of size. And you can see how nicely this patterns out when we think about the whole ones. We found hundreds, there were about 1,500 of these worked sherds from the excavations, both whole ones and broken ones. So people recorded their size, they recorded whether they were whole or broken, they recorded how much each one of them weighed. So this was a beautiful set of data for looking at these otherwise overlooked objects. So these are the whole ones, and you can see that there is a kind of a size distribution so that the majority of them are about 3.5 to 4 centimeters in size, a kind of standardization of the size of these worked sherds. I cannot see you, but I can sense that many people must be saying, worked sherds cannot be money. However, could we be open-minded enough to suggest that maybe worked sherds could be a coin substitute? As a coin substitute, it's something that could be what you could almost say as counterfeited. Worked sherds can be made by people at home, but people at home are also doing many other things that add value to something else. So for example, if they're turning rice into puffed rice or lentils into papad, they're also making a kind of value at home. to exchange. You might object that the value of worked sherds would fluctuate. Well, actual coinage also fluctuates in value due to inflation, due to scarcity of the desired item that you want to exchange the money for. You could say, well, it has no convertible value. It is a discarded potsherd. Well, copper is a discarded rock, but we think of it differently. So base metal coinage also has no convertible value. And if we think about worked sherds as a coin substitute, what we can think of is that maybe worked sherds solves the problem of small change in a booming economy. Let's take a look at the data. When we look at the distribution of worked sherds, and again, many thanks to all of the people who worked with us on those years of excavations, who patiently picked things up and recorded them and put them in the spreadsheets to make the data sets from which we can now try to elicit some understanding of what's happening at the household level. So if we look at the total number of worked sherds per excavation area, you can see that there's a great deal of difference in the amount of worked sherds per area. So this is one of the many reasons why we should not simply discard the concept as hopscotches. First of all, there are too many for it to be a simple gaming piece. Also, the distribution is significantly different depending on the area of the site in which they are found. So when we think about the absolute numbers, you can see that some areas definitely have many more worked sherds than other areas. If we think about the total number of worked sherds per cubic meter of excavated material, in other words, a standardized assessment of the amount of worked sherds, we still get a significant difference. So that the distribution of these items is not uniform across the site the way we might expect if they are hopscotches lost by children playing. Instead, the distribution shows that there is something quite different going on in terms of the distribution of activities involving these worked sherds. And interestingly enough, the area of 0.2 that you see down there, that's the area of the pillars. So the area of the pillars that has a special purpose function is not an area where you're finding very many worked sherds. And moreover, most of the ones in that area were also broken. So they were things that were being, redeposited maybe from fill earth coming from someplace else. So just the numbers themselves suggests some differential purpose should be conceptualized for these objects. Now, if we take the data from those deep soundings, the one where we went all the way from the top down to the very bottom of the site, so each of the zones of removal was about 30 centimeters, so we're going down in 30 centimeter units down to the very bottom. Here you can see this was the squarish one of these deep soundings, and you can see the distribution of these worked sherds increases as we go down in terms of the numbers per standardized unit going up. So you have a 5.8 meter depth, and you have the majority of these worked sherds are sort of down towards the bottom of the sequence. In other words, the first half of the site's occupation. When you look at the radiocarbon dates from this portion of the deep sounding, you can see this early occupation, 8th, 7th centuries BC, and that you get the buildup of an increase in the worked sherds a little bit after the beginning of the occupation. Let's look now at the other of the deep soundings that we did. That was the roundish one where you saw Professor Mohanty. The quantity of worked sherds in this deep sounding is considerably greater, but the overall pattern is the same, that it's in the first half of the site's occupation that you get the majority of these worked sherds, and they pretty much stop appearing in the subsequent levels after about halfway through the site's occupation. And here we got down to a little bit greater depth, 7.3 meters, because this area of the site was a little bit higher than what you get in the western side of the site. Radiocarbon dates tell us the same pattern again, that beginning of the site, very few, and then you get this bump of the influx of large numbers of worked sherds per unit as you go up, and that you've got then a period after which the worked sherds no longer seem to be part of what people are doing. So here's my suggestion, that the worked sherd appearance is a sign of a booming economy with a small change problem right around the time that coinage is first coming into use, but there is probably not enough coinage to go around. And in an urban environment where people are engaging in many small-scale transactions at the household level, as well as big urban finance at the administrative level, there is a need for small tokens, chits, representations of value, and the willingness to accept a broken potsherd that's been shaped overrides skepticism about the value of these small things. And it makes the economy work because it's a belief system, just like any other form of physical valuation. So then you might ask, well, if you have a booming economy represented by these many hundreds of worked sherds in the first part of the site's occupation, does that mean that the city declines afterwards? The answer to that is no, because it is exactly at this time that many other new innovations become part of the archaeological record. It's the beginning of brick making, it's the beginning of tile making, it's the beginning of the use of the abundance of terracotta ornaments. It is the beginning of a particularly exuberant style of pottery decoration. So what has happened is that perhaps real coined money has come into a sufficient abundance that the substitute is no longer required. Or maybe there are more sophisticated record-keeping systems that come in with increased literacy so that you have things like accounting and bookkeeping that don't depend on the physicality of money or a money substitute. So, to be continued in terms of what happens in the second part of the site's life. Thank you very much for the opportunity to raise these possibilities in thinking about money and monetized economies. And many thanks again to all of the people, institutions, and agencies who made this work possible and who provided so much support to our team in the field and to all of us forever afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Monica, for such a wonderful talk and new thoughts and insights and new way of looking into the archaeological material. And it's really an eye-opener for me, at least. I would now request Sharda to take over and moderate the Q&A session. Sharda, are you there? So before Sharda joins, I have one question in the Q&A box. I will put forth that. Aruni from ICHR, he asked,
Certainly, these work shirts could have been valued for people in the said period. However, there are many work shirts, sometimes shirts with perforation found in Neolithic period too in Deccan. Could we consider them as valuable exchanges during the Neolithic Chalcolithic cultures?
So that's a very good question. However, I would caution against running away to think of all worked sherds as being a form of money. Because, clearly the term worked sherd is a value neutral term. And we know that people shaped broken pottery or broken tile for different things. There are very occasionally some that are quite large. They could be scrubbers, rubbers, that kind of thing. People also do play games with broken things. People also do, they're sitting there bored, they create something, or they're creating a spindle whorl by perforating a sherd and then using it to make string. So I think that the answer would be highly dependent on context, but I certainly would suggest that any category of artifact that occurs in a large quantity is certainly worth reevaluating. Maybe we find lots and lots of terracotta beads. Perhaps they are not always just for wearing, or maybe they are used in some other kind of context. So I would encourage creative thinking, but always with looking at the data to back up whether the hypothesis is plausible.
Sharda, can you please take over and moderate?
Yes, okay. So just to clarify, have you begun the
Yeah,
Q&A
I
session?
began and asked the question of Aruni.
Okay, so I'll take up the next one. Yeah, this is by a participant called Shikha Rai, who asks, is there any pattern or definite weight of these work sherds?
So in many cases, we see that the weight is proportional to the size. So had I done a graph of weight, it would look about the same. In some cases, the sherds are made out of potsherds that are a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner. Generally, the sherds are 4.5, 5.5 millimeters thick. They are fairly standardized, but the weight pattern would look quite like the size pattern.
Aruni has another question. So he asks, could you also give us the beginning of urbanization in the Deccan, particularly the places of Ashokan edicts found, namely Maski, Brahmagiri, and Koppala? Why no archaeological evidences of urban centers have been found in those places? So do you have any inputs on these observations?
I think in the Ganges region, in Odisha, there seems to be, it's easier to spot the urban centers because of the rampart walls. But whether there may be some urban centers that are more subtle, I think that is still a very big possibility, that not all urban centers have fortification walls, and maybe there are some that are quite distributed or disconnected, or that have many portions to them that are not in a densely configured space. So that's what I might suggest for that region, that certainly we have urbanism, but it may be more distributed or dispersed than concentrated into a fortified area.
Okay, so the next question is by Lohita. It says that your lecture has increased the curiosity about the study of urban settlement through landscape perspectives, and wants to know, how does a monumental building can be regarded as a prominent urban landscape in a city?
All right, I'm not quite sure about the question.
Mm-hmm.
Is it about that urban centers tend to have monumental structures? because that is certainly the case. I mean, there are monumental structures that can exist anywhere. So think about the megaliths that are distributed, or monumental Buddhist structures. So monumentality does not always mean only urbanism, but urbanism does tend to have that kind of monumental sense to it. And you might think about why people find large buildings to be impressive, or comforting, or symbolic. I think much of the rampart constructions and the gateways are just as much symbolic as they are practical. So a gateway is good for taxation, for controlling people, for controlling animals coming into the city, for keeping security and things like that. But a gateway is also this sort of grand monumental feeling. And think about the architecture of our modern cities. People think of Paris, they think of the Eiffel Tower, a monumental, useless structure, but very monumental. Or think about the idea of Delhi, or any other place that also has monumental architecture as part of its urban sense of self.
Okay. So the next question is by Pallavi Gokhale, who asks, do we have other examples from contemporary or other periods of this kind where similar hypotheses can be applied, either in South Asia or elsewhere?
I would invite the audience to take this hypothesis and see, because it would require having the data recorded. That if there are other sites where such tokens have been recorded. There's been work in Mesopotamia on what they call jetons, or tokens. There's a whole working group in Europe I've just found out about, who are looking at the Mediterranean and the idea of tokens of various kinds. So I think it is absolutely possible to be able to evaluate this hypothesis on the basis of other localities, and I would be very interested to see other people try. Yes, please.
So the next comment and a question is by Anirudh Bahuguna, who says that he wants to tell you, he wants to share with you that he has worked with you as a student excavation in Odisha, and now he's doing research on forts and their structures, and he has a question related to the origin of the term Gad, because in many places the word Gad stands for forts. So your thoughts on this?
Yes, exactly. And perhaps there are even places that have that Gad that are no longer obviously forts. Rampart walls are easy to take apart, but sometimes language lasts for a very long time. So I would like to take the opportunity to say thank you for the work and for the question, because it's something that does make us think about other places and other possibilities for evaluating urbanism, a little bit like the South Indian question, that is a place that is a Gad an inhabited fort? They could be empty. But when we did the survey at Sisupalgarh, we could say, no, actually, this fort was full of people. It would be very interesting if there were some contemporaneous forts that did not have people. Is that because they had not grown yet as a city? Jogad in Odisha also has the same kind of outline, but does not seem to have been occupied to the same extent. So when we think about urbanism, some cities are occupied without fortification. Some places are fortified and occupied, and some places are fortified and somewhat empty. So there's probably much more diversity in early historic urbanism that remains to be explored.
So the next question is by P.V. Radhakrishnan, and he asks, what is the date of these worked potsherds? Because in India, the coined money begins somewhere around the 5th century BC.
Right, so we can go back to I think we can go back to this
slide.
image and look at it in more detail. Right, so here is the image that has the radiocarbon dates. And so it does look like the boom of the worked sherds is coincident with the earliest timing of coinage. So that's why I'm suggesting that maybe the concept of coinage becomes very widespread before the mints can catch up, because some mining is required, some expertise is required, smelting is required. So the idea of a small value token, the ideas can spread incredibly quickly. And if people find it convenient and useful as a fiction, money as a fiction of value, to be able to just make something that's a placeholder, just like a chocolate is a placeholder. That's what I think might be happening.
Okay. VR Guru Prasad asked, could these work sherds have been used as tokens?
Okay. So as tokens, yes, I think the word token would be a perfectly good word to think about. Whatever word one ascribes as a jeton, as a token, as a worked sherd, it's a placeholder for something. There probably is a good Sanskrit word that we should also think about.
Okay. So the next question is, this is by Jayendra Joglekar, who thanks you for this wonderful talk. And he appreciates that your approach towards contextual understanding of the archaeological record is worth emulating. And just for curiosity, he asks, can different types or wares of work sherds, could they have been different, could they have had different values for exchange?
Maybe. So the next thing to do with this data set is to look at the proportions of worked sherds that have decoration, which are not very many. They're made from a pot that had a decorated part. So most of the worked sherds don't have any representation of anything on them. It would be interesting to look at, where do the worked sherds appear that are made out of infrequently found vessel types? For example, there are a few worked sherds that are made out of highly burnished, reduced fired ware, like the bottom of a knobbed ware vessel. Are people selecting that kind of sherd specifically for making a worked sherd? I don't know yet. I would have to do more with the data set to see if people are preferentially selecting certain kinds of sherds to make the worked sherd. It's clear that some parts of the vessel are definitely rejected. So there are only a couple, there's more than 1,500 worked sherds. There are only 2 that have a curvature because they're made from a neck. So nobody wants to make one from a neck. Nobody wants to have one from a neck, even though there should be n number of neck sherds that could have been used. People are making some selection. How much selection? I think we have to do some more statistics to see.
So he has a follow-up question. Are there any graffiti or scribe marks on any of these worked sherds?
Very, very few, about 2 or 3. And again, these seem to be associated with the flat bottomed, burnished, reduced vessels. And we do get fragments, many fragments of these that are not made into worked sherds. And that's where we get the graffiti marks, is on the underside of these big, they're about 35 centimeters across. They're flat, nicely made, high fired. But I think it's only because the sherd happened to be made from that vessel, not that the worked sherd was made and then somebody marked it. That does not seem to have been the case.
Okay. So the next question is by Dr. Sneha. I don't see a surname here. And she asks, can your hypothesis be extrapolated or extended to other time periods? For instance, can it be applied to the civilization period?
Again, the context is key. And a certain amount of volume is also required, so that if there are one or two worked sherds in a site, that's probably not a good case of token or coin substitute or valuation use. But if you have hundreds of them, then it is certainly worth asking the question what they were used for or why they were made. Yes, I think that it could be usefully applied in many cases that way.
Okay. So the next question is by S.P. Darshana, who thanks you for a wonderful lecture and asks, have you done any comparative study with other sites yielding work sherds in the same cultural period?
Not yet. This is just an absolutely new inquiry that I'm having about these worked sherds. In fact, I was just, creating some of these graphs this morning itself because I wanted to go into the data set and see, and I could not have predicted that this particular graph, for example, would have turned into this. So I'm very actively thinking about what the implications are. So your questions are extremely helpful. Your observations that I'm seeing in the question and answer in the chat are extremely helpful for having some better thoughts about how to evaluate this proposition. So thank you.
Okay, so just a few more questions, but I see that I feel we are at the end of the Q&A box and then a few more pop up at the end. So I'll try to cover as many as I can. So the next one is by Priyank Gupta, who asks, who says, just like you shared the idea of taxation being introduced during the second urbanization period in the Middle Ganga Valley, do we also get any reference of taxation during the Harappan civilization, as we have found structures like community granaries and other public spaces which would have consumed a huge amount of resources? In brackets, he says money, question mark. What are your comments on this?
So anytime there is collective activity, there should be some explanation as to who organized it and how it was compensated. And the way that I talk about this in my class is that when I talk about a place, I usually have a class of about 300 students, right? So we think about a big monumental structure, a rampart, a mound, or something created by people. And I ask the students, I say, so if you're shifting house and you need some help, your friends will come and help you for a day. Your very good friends will help you for 2 days. But will you be carrying something every single day for 6 months or a year or 2 years? And everyone just laughs and shakes their heads. No, right? There must be some other organizational principle. Anytime you get any kind of monumental structure, people are being encouraged, people are being taxed, people are being forced, people are using it as a devotional act, but there is some organizing principle that's absolutely required in any case.
Okay, so you mentioned context just a few sentences ago. And so here's a question by an anonymous attendee who focuses on this particular point. So he or she asks, what are or which are the contexts of these work sherds found in Sisupalgarh? Do you have proper coins reported from the same stratigraphy of these sherds?
So that's a very interesting question about coins. In Professor Lal's excavation, he found about 30 coins or so, which is not an enormous number compared to the amount of area that he excavated. We have found many fewer coins, just a handful, about 6 or 8 or 10, some metal flanges that are so worn we can't quite tell if they're actually coins or not. So the actual number of coins is extremely low from the excavations compared to what one might expect for the early historic period, and certainly, you know, compared to the amount of worked sherds that we have recovered. So the mystery of the relative lack of coinage at Sisupalgarh, with so many areas excavated, I think that we're fairly certain that, you know, we're seeing something that's representative of what's actually happening in the economy of the site, that we simply don't see that much actual coined money. It's relatively low compared to other early historic sites. So that gets back to the question about, you know, comparative work with other early historic sites. Other sites may not, at the time that they were excavated many years ago, people may not have tallied the worked sherds, but they certainly would have tallied the coinage. So that, I think, might be a very good place to start in terms of comparative economic analysis. So yes, thank you.
The next question is by Eric Olejdam. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. I'm sorry for that. So he says, I have some similarly looking worked sherds from a survey in Oman. They are different from worked sherd spindle whorls. The overall context is one where local villages became temporarily incorporated in a larger economic system at the end of the 19th and early 20th century AD. So the number of sherds are too few to do a systematic evaluation, but the context seems to fit your proposed hypothesis.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, I would absolutely, you know, welcome some further correspondence with anybody. I'm easy to find. I'm at University of California, Los Angeles. So I would be very interested in hearing about other potential comparative cases, and just opening up the idea of the small change problem in antiquity or even in modern times. And especially right now with this idea of Bitcoin. I saw that there was a question also about NFTs. You know, the idea of what is money anyway is actually a very galvanizing contemporary question.
Ananya Chakrabarti has a question and an observation that sometimes similar to the hopscotch or worked potsherd, we also find hopscotches in stone. Can they be considered, can this hypothesis of token be also applied there?
Certainly it's worth hypothesizing. I mean, the thing about a hypothesis is it's a question that you can test against the data, you know, and then also looking at the context. Are they always found in a particular kind of context? Are they numerous in a site or just one or two? Are they from a stone that's locally available, or is it something that's part of a long distance, you know, geologically long distance interaction? But I think everything that we find archaeologically, it got to the site because somebody brought it there. And when we touch it, when we engage with it, we get a chance to think about why that happened.
Okay, so the next question is by Adhya Bhargava, who asks, how does this monetization hypothesis help in decoupling the city and state as a seat of political authority in terms of urban interconnectedness and vis-a-vis having separate identity and characteristics of their own, which are dissimilar in nature from their functionality or nature of their functionality?
Yes. So again, I would refer you to Abhijit Dandakar's very nice lecture on coinage, because that's an aspect that he covers there about the royal coinage and then coinage that is made by individual cities. And this sense of multiple simultaneous monetizations might be similar to the way that we have in contemporary life, that we have both coined money from the state and then also things like, you know, canteen tokens and bus tokens that are the result of public-private partnerships of value creation and things like that. So money can come from a state, but it doesn't have to. And in the medieval period, there's many private mints and all kinds of things that we find very difficult to believe. How could there be a private mint? The mint is the purview of the government. But in many ancient and not so ancient contexts, moneying is something that is outsourced from a government to a private entity.
Okay, I'm going to club two very small questions. One is by Shreyasi Rai Chaudhary and the other is by Aruni. So do you see any foreign influence on these work shirts, and are there any shirts made from the northern black polished ware?
So at Sisupalgarh, we don't seem to have the classic northern black polished ware that one gets in the Ganges Valley. There are maybe one or two sherds out of many hundreds of thousands of sherds I have seen that might be something that one would call, real NBP. There is a category of reduced, high-fired, polished ware that is knobbed ware, which is the vessel, again, is about 35 centimeters in size, a flat bottom, just like a big thali actually. And then it has a little pucker in the middle, that's the knobbed ware. And then, in the early parts of the site, it's found in that first half of the occupation, and it comprises about 3 to 4% of the total of the ceramics. There's also a very few sherds of rouletted ware. So like coinage, like real coins, we get very few pieces of real rouletted ware. It's somewhere around 20 or 30 in the entire excavation. But again, that is a kind of, high-fired, reduced ware, well, constructed, finely levigated pottery. There are no worked sherds out of rouletted ware. There are a few sherds out of the highly polished, reduced ware. There are no worked sherds out of NBP.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 more questions which are directly related to the topic of today's. One is by Pallavi Gokhale, who says that about the lowering quantities of these in the later period, you correlated this with the probability of emergence of accounting systems or practices. Even then, the record keeping is taken care of, but the need of small money may not decrease. What do you think about that?
Yes, so even though we have elaborate accounting systems now, we still have a small change problem. So one would have to look into how non-monetized systems happen. Like, how do our phone payment concepts happen? This is actually a big problem for banking institutions and phones, because a phone is supposed to be a communications device and a bank is supposed to be a financial device. And when phone companies start to hold money, does that mean that they're a bank? So economic anthropologists are looking into what jurisdictions different kinds of values have. You could also potentially have different labor systems. I really don't know. I don't know why the small change problem would not go away. It would seem to always be there, but I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that. But I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Okay, so Emma Cornell asks, can we say that monetization has brought people together and helped the governing bodies of that time to exploit or rule over them?
Exchange certainly brings people together. Urbanism also offers more potential opportunities, which is why cities have been growing ever since they began and why cities are growing now. Cities are places where people go because they believe that life will be improved. We know that that is not objectively always true, but in the US, in Mexico, in China, and India, and all over sub-Saharan Africa, people come into cities because they think that their lives will be improved. And cities also necessarily have people engage with money. You can live in a farming village without money, but you cannot live in a city without some form of value exchange, tangible or otherwise.
Okay. There are a lot of questions I see in the chat box, but slightly deviating from the topic. And in the interest of time, I think I will not take them, but I see that Michelle has a question to ask you. So we do have time for that. And probably that's the last one.
It's a bit off track, actually, maybe completely off track. I seem to notice, Monica, that there's a big concentration in the northern area of the city of those worked shards. And I was remembering the Arthashastra, since after all, there have been comparisons by yourself and Professor Monti between the overall town plan of Sisupalgarh and Arthashastra. And in Arthashastra, there is some talk of the gem workers and the metal workers being located in the northern part of the city. So I was just wondering if you have thought about this possible correlation, possible because it may not be very valid also. And I don't think people were scrupulous in applying the Arthashastra model in every respect necessarily. But could there be some broad correlation that could be worked out between the more, intensely economic part of the city, either according to the excavations or according to Arthashastra? That was just the thought.
So I think primary reason for so much data from the north is that the data we have from the south is all from the survey. We did not have any excavations in the southern portion of the site. And so, again, that would be the reason why sites are investigated over and over again in different generations, is that people come with new questions, they come with new methods and techniques. And so this is an example of one of the many, many additional questions that, every answer yields many more new questions. And so I think that would be another very good hypothesis to investigate. What exactly is the condition of urban life for people living in the southern portion of the site?
Very well. So I think it's time to thank you for this very thought-provoking talk with a lot of original hypotheses and a new way of looking at the economic life, whether ancient or current. And I think we will be thinking about it for a long time. And we hope to interact with you much more, and possibly through an in-person visit one of these days, whenever the situation permits.
That would be my great pleasure. Thanks to all of you for hosting. Thanks to all of you for listening. I see many people who worked with us at Sisupalgarh in the chat and the Q&A, and it's because of your work that any of this was possible. So I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monica. And thanks to everyone for joining. Thank you.